The poverty that exists in our world, the concrete poverty that affects children, young people, adults, the poverty that so often we are not aware of, and yet we are called as disciples of Jesus to be people committed to poverty. When I think of poverty, I think the hardest poverty to which I'm called, and perhaps you are as well, is to admit at times I don't have control. The hardest poverty is not owning things. The hardest poverty is not being hungry or homeless. The hardest poverty is not being in control. And for any of us not to be in control, that is poverty. Poverty means I depend on a good and gracious God for who I am and what is mine, because they are gifts to me. That is the power of the feast we celebrate in a few weeks. Whereas one poet put it, that we are invited to hold a shivering God within our hands. And that shivering God, in turn, holds us. To be open to that lack of control, to admit that I believe and I hope in a good and gracious God, is truly something that stewardship makes us aware of. Let me skip a few of these comments here and get to just the final comments that I'd like to share with you. And that is that stewardship involves a far more radical challenge than the sharing of our resources with the church. There is no doubt that it is important to ask people to live a life of stewardship, which is prayerful, planned, proportionate, and sacrificial. Those are the big words we use so often. Prayerful, planned, proportional, and sacrificial when it comes to sharing one's resources with one's parish, diocese, and the universal church. But my friends, no program, no choice of words, no stewardship appeal slogan, no brochure, no letter from the pastor or even from the bishop will have any long-term effect on the lives of people to encourage them to live a life of stewardship if the far more fundamental issue of faith and conversion is not addressed. The issue of faith and conversion is behind the call to stewardship. And it's an issue of faith and conversion that you have to speak to people on their own terms. One of the great benefits was mentioned is the benefit of having lived in 3 different parts of our country, in the Archdiocese of Chicago, and the tremendous Church of Eastern Montana, and now in the Church of Western Washington. I have to admit, when I was asked to go to Great Falls, Montana, I didn't know the country went that far west. I really didn't. And yet, living in that particular area of the country taught me, a lot of people talk about the church in the United States as if it's one. It's like asking, what's the weather like in the United States? And all you have to do is look at the back of the front section of USA Today to see it differs the same way with the church. Like, that is why it's so important when you talk about faith and conversion. Here in Indiana, we have to recognize the differences in which we proclaim that faith and call people to conversion. I remember the story I told it last week of when I was in eastern Montana. I was in a town called Harlem, Montana. And Harlem, Montana was not a major metropolitan center. In fact, it wasn't much of anything. But in fact, the rectory was so small you couldn't even stay there overnight with the pastor. And so he had arranged for me to stay with this farm family about 6 miles outside town. And the family was very nice and very good. And I was given a room in a separate trailer outside the main house where 2 of the older boys also had their rooms. And so there was a bath and a room and everything there, and very nice, and the boys took care of me. We had pizza and pop and stuff, and went to bed about 10 o'clock. Well, anyway, right before I went to bed, Brian, the oldest, knocked on the door and said, Bishop, tonight we're probably going to have calves. So if you'd like to come out to the barn to see us having calves, would you like to do it? And so I politely said, well, why don't you knock gently on the door and let me know if it's happening? So Brian said, fine. About 2 in the morning, to ask a 16-year-old kid to knock gently on the door is to give you some idea of the great quake in the San Andreas Fault. Anyway, Brian pounded on the door, got me up, and I went out to the barn. It was February. I'll never forget. But anyway, I went out to the barn, and there's this calving going on. And again, I remember this so vividly. I was watching this calving taking place, and I guess I was turning white because I had never seen it before. And I still remember Brian turning to me and saying, Bishop, ain't you ever seen calving before? And all I remember saying to Brian was, they don't do this in downtown Chicago. Faith and conversion It's amazing the wisdom that I shared with Eastern Montana after the experience of Cavi. It spoke of life and resurrection in ways I never spoke of before. Stewardship likewise requires a new vision. The stewardship vision is the ability to see with eyes of faith the need to share our resources, time, talents, and possessions in ways that enable us to recognize Christ's presence among us in who we are and the gifts of time, talent, and resources which we possess. Let me conclude by two stories. One is a reference that is truly magnificent of two bodies of water in the Scriptures. One is the Dead Sea and the other is the Sea of Galilee. From what I understand, I've never had the privilege of being in the Holy Land, that 2,000 years ago the Dead Sea was dead, and it still is, my friends. 2,000 years ago, Jesus went to the Sea of Galilee and gathered the first disciples to come follow him. And that Sea of Galilee was filled with fish and teeming with fish and still is. What's the difference between the two bodies of water? The Dead Sea takes and does not give. And when you take and do not give, you are dead. The Sea of Galilee is a body of water that takes and gives. It is alive and filled with life and teeming with the presence of vegetation and the signs of God's presence among us. That's a wonderful example, at least for me, of what stewardship calls us to be. People who are willing to take and to give. And you and I have taken much. We have taken the gifts of a good and gracious God, and we are asked now to share them. The pastoral letter on stewardship does have a certain urgency. As we say in the introduction to the pastoral letter, it is addressed to us, Catholic citizens of a wealthy, powerful nation facing many questions about its identity and role in the waning years of a troubled century. Members of a community of faith blessed with many human and natural resources, yet often uncertain about how to sustain them and use them. Let me share with you a story that gives hopefully a response to how we might use them. Time before time, when the world was young, two brothers shared a field and a mill. Excuse me. Each night they divided evenly the grain they had ground together during the day. One brother lived alone, the other had a wife and a large family. One day the single brother thought to himself, "It isn't really fair that we divide the grain evenly. I have only myself to care for, but my brother has children to feed." So each night he secretly took some of his grain to his brother's granary to see that he was never without. But the married brother said to himself one day, "It isn't fair that we divide the grain evenly, because I have children to provide for me in my old age, but my brother has no one. What will he do when he's old?" So every night he secretly took some of his grain to his brother's granary. As a result, both of them always found their supply of grain mysteriously replenished each morning. Then one night, they met each other halfway between their two houses, and they suddenly realized what had been happening all this time, and they embraced each other in love. The story goes that God witnessed their meeting and proclaimed, "This is a holy place, a place of love, and here it is that my temple shall be built." My friends, the commitment to stewardship is the opportunity for us to share our gifts, gifts given to us by a good and gracious God, and to build a holy place within our lives, our parishes, our dioceses, our church. It is the willingness to assume a lifestyle of sharing and in the divine economy to discover the richness of finding God. It's a journey well worth taking, a journey that brings us here. It's really worth coming to Indiana.